Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more particularly from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform that you are watching in, assuming that you're watching live, and they will show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And I believe most all of the platforms will do that. There might be a couple that don't. Um, but for the most part, if you want to say hello, if you have a question, if you have a comment, they will show up right here, as Reverend Michael just has. Hello, Reverend Michael. It's good to see you. And today, our subject is shamanism. Yesterday, we were talking about animism. And shamanism is another, another term that shows up a lot in contemporary spirituality. And I thought that I would talk about it. And hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you, Antonio. And there are a lot, in my opinion, of misconceptions about what shamanism means and where this term and concept come from. And hello to Reverend Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. Shamanism is a term that comes out of the Russian language. Shaman is a term that comes out of the Russian language. It has been used in the Russian language to describe particularly spiritual practices of Northern Europe for about 500 years. It began to be used in more Western European languages 400 to 500 years ago. It has a very long European usage. It was used to describe the religious practices of Siberian tribes, the Sami people. Um, a couple of hundred years ago, it was applied to indigenous practices of Asian peoples such as Korea, for example, and the Mongols, for example. It has a long history that I think most people, especially most Americans, are completely unaware of in terms of where this word comes from and what it previously has been used to mean. Hello to Bimby in the chat room, if I didn't already say that. Shaman comes out of the Russian language where it's pronounced exactly the same way. And where it comes from before that is a pretty big question. And there are a couple of different theories, but they're only theories because nobody actually knows. Um, a lot of people believe that it comes from a Tunguskic language, uh, probably Evenki. However, the fact that we have to say a Tunguskic language tells you that this is far from a settled theory, and it is certainly not universally accepted. There is also a theory that it comes out of Sanskrit. And in Sanskrit, the word shramana refers to a wandering holy figure and is found in many Asian languages and could very well also be the original origin of the word shaman. It shows up, for example, in Gandhari as shamana, Tocharian A as shamam, Tocharian B as shamane, and in Chinese as shaman. Um, so exactly where the word comes from before Russian, as I say, is highly debatable. And this is something that's also frequently not talked about. Or people will very confidently say, oh, it definitely comes from this or that. But there's no agreement and no absolute evidence on exactly where it comes from before Russian. What does shaman mean? Generally speaking, shamanism is the idea of using trance for spiritual journeys. Different religious systems that are described as shamanic may have different systems for doing this and different destinations that they go to, but generally it's some version of the spirit world. And the trance is often achieved through things like drumming or other sound practices, through dancing or through chanting. And I have to say that the use of this sort of trance induced through these sorts of elements is not exactly limited. You find it in many different spiritualities around the world. You find it all over the place. And hello to Nikki in the chat room. It's good to see you, Nikki. And a lot of people, especially these days, get terribly upset over the word shaman, thinking that it comes out of Native American culture. Its association with Native American culture is actually fairly recent. Um, Outside of academic circles, I would say within my own lifetime, these are where the term actually comes from. And some of the European forms of shamanism are very interesting to look at, and they often are very similar to Native American shamanism, and sometimes not so similar. If you've ever seen Korean shamans at work, um, you can easily see the practices that we've just been describing. Spirit work through trance, aided by dance and music, but it looks like nothing but itself. It is absolutely beautiful. If you have never seen Korean shamans, I recommend you go to YouTube after this program or at your earliest convenience and look some up. There's all kinds of video of Korean shamans all over YouTube. And this may be a form of shamanism that you may be completely unfamiliar with. And it's been called that for a very long time. Um, and the practice is immemorial. You see similar things in various forms of Buddhism. Uh, you see um, you see it in many different systems. You certainly see it in modern Western spirituality in varying different forms. We use trance exceedingly often and very often for journeys into the spirit world. We are a little bit less likely to use sound techniques, but I don't see that that makes a big difference. So I would consider many of um, our Western contemporary spiritual movements to be shamanistic in character because they do the stuff um, in the same way. One of the most interesting theories that I've encountered in recent years is the idea that ancient Egyptian religion should be considered shamanic. And this is certainly not a dominant theory, but it's a pretty convincing one when you look at it, because a lot of Egyptian theology does talk about journeys into the spirit world, and has a good bit of Egyptian wisdom literature describes living people taking these journeys. And if you look at the practice of Egyptian religion, one of the things you're going to notice is the presence of a great many priestesses who are often rather dismissively referred to as chantresses or musicians. Um, but if you look at the way they're actually referred to in the writings, in the surviving works, they were obviously people who were performing the role of a clerical type of role, not just musicians. Um, I think that if you look at examinations of Egyptian religion, you will see that there is a fairly concerted attempt to minimize the role of women in Egyptian religion when they obviously were playing a very vital role repeatedly over many generations. Um, Now, Magical Mermaid says, I always wondered if natives acknowledge magic in a traditional sense. I assume that by traditional sense in the same way that Europeans do. And, that is, well, you can never make a blanket answer to a question like that. But in many cases, I believe the answer has been yes. Um, but that's something that is not particularly easy to find information on. But it's out there, and if you look for it, you can find it. Um, Particularly in some of the earlier sources, where again the prejudices of people writing books were perhaps a little different than they are now. There's been in the 20th century a huge attempt, particularly with Native Americans, to fit them into a certain box. Um, Native Americans and South Americans of having been, um, you know, kind of that traditional European um, stereotype of noble savages. In this case, happy socialists living these perfectly egalitarian lives, which for the most part don't actually describe what appears to have been the case. Particularly as we look at Central America and other places, we now know that much of the land that was no longer, how can I put it? Much of the Americas were cities about 1,000 years ago. Um, there were a number of civilizations built around cities which were gone by the time that European settlers arrived in those areas. Probably through disease, possibly through war. And the diseases probably came from the European settlers, but one doesn't really know. But a lot of what people said in the last 200 years about the history of this continent is very obviously not true, and modern archaeology has shown that pretty clearly. Um, Many of the pristine forests where people never dwelled were formerly cities, and that has, in many cases, been pretty clearly proven at this point. It was a highly urbanized culture in much of North America, still was in Central America when Europeans made their disastrous contact with it, and apparently also much more of South America. Many of those. There's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it to you if you want to understand the history of pre-Columbian America, called 1492, I believe it is. Or no, I believe it's 1491. Um, it's been a while since I read it. I believe it's called 1491, and it basically dispels a lot of the myths that used to be believed about pre-Columbian America. And if you look at archaeology in recent years, meaning the last 40 years, all it's done is push the dates of these different peoples farther back in time, push the dates of the civilizations of the Americas earlier in history than they were formerly credited with. And it certainly has painted a very different picture than what was once thought. But of course, I'm sure we all realize that what was formerly being taught about pre-Columbian America was heavily influenced by racism, to the point that as late as the 1970s, as evidence was mounting that Native Americans had been here longer than academia wanted to admit, they were literally covering up a lot of the evidence. And Mary says 1491 by Charles Mann. Yes, that's the one. 1491 by Charles Mann. I highly recommend it. And it talks about the cover up of the evidence that pointed to earlier origins. Um, and this is something that I think is important not only to understanding pre Columbian American culture and civilization, but a lot of things. And in the Wiccan world, one of our big controversies is the extent to which Wicca is a revival, a survival, or a purely modern creation. And you should know that I come from the idea that it is a survival of earlier things, which is certainly not the majority view of the moment. But when I look at the evidence, I find it rather convincing. Maybe we'll do a show on that someday. But when I look at things like this, where you clearly see the prejudices of the academic authorities um, enforcing a certain point of view to the point of actually covering up things that disagreed with them, I think we need to consider that also when we look at anything that goes against the accepted wisdom. Now, when I say that, am I saying that I agree with Margaret Murray? No, I don't. However, having said that, I don't completely disagree with her either. I think she read too much into it. Um, I think that Carlos Ginzburg has some very interesting writings on the subject. There are a number of other interesting writings, including some contemporary ones that are pretty hard to get around unless you just plain want to get around them. But that's another show and a much more complicated topic than a couple of minutes is going to get us through. But I think that we make a mistake to just go with the accepted wisdom. I guess I will follow this a little farther along. One of the things, and I am a Corellian, and we are not particularly related to, for example, the Gardnerians. However, one of the criticisms most often made against Gerald Gardner and the idea that he invented his materials is that his early modern English was not accurate. Um, that he was obviously faking early modern English and not doing a good job with it. And it's absolutely true that the writings Gardner referred to that used early modern English were not using early modern English. Um, and would not pass for early modern English. But there is a complexity in this question that is often ignored, and that is that there's also something called early modern Scottish. English and Scottish are two different languages, although some people would describe them as dialects. And if you take that same writing and look at early modern Scottish, you'll come to a different conclusion. It fits much more with early modern Scottish forms. And the Gaelic words that show up are Scottish. Um, and this is something, the only person that I've really heard speak about this at any length is Donald Frew, um, who I think is well worth listening to on the subject. And in fact, you can see him speak about it on Magic TV in an interview many years ago. One of the things he pointed out specifically as an example of this is that in the Gardnerian writings, there is a phrase instructing initiates to copy the Book of Shadows in their own, quote, hand of right, end quote. And it's often pointed out that this is absolutely not a phrase that would ever have been used in early modern English. That is, it is, if anything, a French phrase. Except the problem, again, is if you look at early modern Scottish, you will find people using that phrase because of the old alliance with France. And this sort of French form was more common in early Scottish writing. And Magical Mermaid says, quote, language lost in translation. And this is the thing, because as far as I can tell, a lot of times people are so hasty in trying to disprove any suggestion of Wicca as an older movement that they don't really think very widely about what they're doing. As I say, Donald Frew is the only person I've heard speak at length um, on the idea that this is actually early modern Scottish rather than a bad imitation of early modern English. But as a language nerd, I completely agree with this. Um, it is um, kind of obvious when you start looking at it from that lens. But of course, again, speaking of prejudice in academia, it's only fairly recently that Scottish is even recognized as a language in its own right, rather than a degenerate dialect of English. So it's not entirely surprising that people weren't looking at that. But for us, we should be. And again, when you look at the Gaelic forms, a lot of people will, in modern Wicca, go straight to Irish Gaelic. They're not Irish Gaelic, they're Scottish. Um, and, there's a level where this has nothing to do with anything, and a level where it's really important at the same time. Because, of course, the only thing that really matters is who we are now and where we're going now. And I've heard people say, well, if you don't know where you've been, you can't tell where you're going. And that is absolute nonsense. Um, I, I have myself found myself lost in downtown cities on occasion and been able to find my way by knowing where I am, but not necessarily where I was. Um, I think we spend too much time looking at our past and basically need to be looking at our future. But having said that, I think that there is a very concerted effort to discredit our past that really is not all that legitimate. Um, Continuing this theme just a little farther, Hazelton has written at length about the figure of Dorothy Clutterbuck and whether or not she was, in fact, we'll say, a pagan priestess. And at this point, there's absolutely no question that she was involved in metaphysics. Despite the fact that some other people have tried to say she couldn't possibly have been, it's been shown that she was. But Hazelton examines her so-called diaries, and I can't imagine for someone who lived in the 1920s and 30s anything more like a smoking gun saying that yes, she was than the writings in those diaries. It's full of odes and hymns to pagan deities. Um, Not necessarily the same ones that we would immediately go to, but you could publish most of them in a modern pagan magazine and not tell that they weren't modern, except she does use a lot of these and thous. Um, but other than that, a contemporary pagan could be writing them. And this is something I think we do well to pay some attention to. Now, Mary in the chat room, Mary Hawk says, what matters to me is having a spiritual practice that is meaningful to me. And I have to agree, that's the only thing that really matters in this moment. How we got here really isn't all that relevant to where we're going. And I see a lot of our community totally lost in worrying about how we got here and totally clueless for how to get anywhere else. Um, they just keep arguing the same things over and over for the last 40 years, um, which really have no meaningful result for actual pagan people trying to move forward into the future. Magical Mermaid says, getting lost can be a way of finding ourselves. Well, yes, it can. Um, so I don't want to go too far into that subject because I don't think it's all that relevant. But having gotten there through talking about academic prejudice regarding Native American culture, I think it's worth considering it as being a force across the board. If you look at traditional Chinese culture and what Western academia has had to say about it, um, they've been very focused on um, moving the dates of traditional Chinese chronologies later in time, but I don't know that there's any particular reason to have done that. And these are things that when almost all other archaeological dates are going farther back, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But Bimby says, I think a lot of our societal problems are because too many people are tied to their past, strangled by it, and can't move forward. I completely agree. In fact, if you look at most of the negative things happening in the world today, they're entirely bound up in things of the past, not the needs of the future, not the needs of the present, but the prejudices of the past. Um, and so I don't think it's a subject that we should put a lot of thought into. I think that we really need, and as a general rule, I try to focus on where we are and where we're going and how we can best get there. Um, but that's not to say it's not worth any consideration either. So those are some of my thoughts on shamanism, on academia, in regard to unpopular topics, and um, and a little bit on Wiccan history. And Nikki says, I agree um, with being focused on where we're going, because it doesn't matter where we've been if we don't get into the future. There is a line in The Lord of the Rings about childless old men endlessly studying their family trees. And to some extent, I think that kind of describes a lot of the current pagan movement. Um, no concern for the future, only concerned with the past, and ignoring the forces around us, many of which don't intend for us to have a future. We've talked a few times about the rise of Christian dominionism. We have no place in the world they wish to create. And we had better be aware of that, because I assure you they are. Um, when we see decrees from state supreme courts using the Bible as their reasoning, we have every reason to be quite alarmed by that. And we need to be looking not at where we've come from, but where we are sitting right now and where we hope to be 20 or 30 years from now and how we're going to get there. Because where we've been in the past isn't going to matter to anyone if we're not also there in the future. So, with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I hope that you found this talk interesting. Magical Mermaid says it was a great topic. Thank you, Magical Mermaid. Um, Tomorrow, I will be joined by Chris Copeland. We'll be talking about the latest things from Corellian Publishing. And I hope to see you then. And until then, let us close with our prayers, we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do in our lives, and we ask you to help us to see clearly where we are and to find the best ways into our future. Let us be mindful of our past, but not bound by it. And let us rather be mindful and guided by our beliefs and our understandings as we move into that future. And let us be bound by nothing, but always open to growth, to development, and to change when it is necessary. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great thanks and love, and knowing you are always with us. But from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.